Okay, so we are in 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 29 tonight. We're almost at the end, coming to the end of this book. Went through a couple of really interesting chapters last week. Chapter 27 was where David, it was kind of the beginning of the end for David, and also the beginning of the end, well, not for David, sorry, the beginning of the end of David's time as a fugitive, where he is fleeing from Saul, but also the beginning of the end of Saul's reign. And so we're kind of seeing how everything is starting to kind of come to the climax of our story of David and Saul. David, in chapter 27, he gets to this point where he's just completely at the end of his rope. He is under so much stress. And he basically just kind of says, I don't know what to do. I don't have any clear direction of where I'm supposed to go or how I'm supposed to lead these people who are with me. How I can continue to escape from Saul. He's just continually after me. There's nothing I can do. And there's nothing better now except for, and he just takes this drastic action of, I'm going to go into the Philistine territory and I'm going to go live there. Because then if I go there, then Saul will stop hunting me. And so that's what he does. He takes all of his, he has 600 men now, and their families as well. So it's a very large group of people, and they move over to the Philistine territory. He goes to Achish, which is the king of Gath. There are 5 major cities in Philistine territory, and each one of those 5 major cities has a king. And so that's kind of how the Philistines ruled, was by 5 major kings or lords or rulers, whatever your translation says. And those cities were, let me see if I can find them here. We have, yep, I'm just going to get up and point them out. We have Gath here, and Gaza maybe? I can't remember. Yes, Gaza, and then Ascalon, Ashdod, and Ekron. And those were the 5 major cities that made up the Philistine territory right here on this portion. And so David had already had interaction with Achish, king of Gath. And so that is who he returns to at that point. And he convinces Achish that he is an enemy of Israel, and he is on their side. He's like, listen, I'm for hire. Me and my men work for hire. And he convinces him to confide in him almost, and to be under his employment. And then he also convinces Achish to give him and his men a city to live in, and that's Ziklag. And that is where we are at in chapter 29. So chapter 29, I'm just going to go ahead and start reading here. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek while the Israelites were camping by the spring, which is in Jezreel. So if you remember, chapter 28 talked about how the Philistines were starting to gather to go to war against Israel. And that's where Saul did the very wicked and foolish thing of consulting with a medium to try to find some sort of guidance or instruction in this. Because he was at the end of his rope as well, kind of like David. But when he turned to God and he asked for a word from God, God was silent. And the reason for that is because every time God tried to give a word to Saul, Saul shut his ears to it. And he is continually going against the will of God. And so finally God said, I guess I'm not going to give you anything. You don't even care about it. You're not listening. I'm not going to give you a word for you to continue to shut your ears against that word. That's actually, if you think about it, that's a little bit of grace, honestly. It's kind of like if I tell my child, don't do that, and then they turn around and they do that, I'm more angry because they heard me say, don't do that, right? So it's kind of that same thing. It's almost a grace thing that God did not give any word to Saul, because more than likely Saul would have disregarded it completely. Clearly, he was not in a very godly state of his life, because he turned around and he went to a medium immediately after. Not a great move, Saul. And he finds a bad word there from that encounter. So we have the Philistines. They're gathering all their armies together, and they're going up to Aphek. Aphek is okay. So you see this yellow part right here is Ephraim. It's kind of over by Samaria-ish area, kind of the northern-ish part of Ephraim's territory. So they're coming from down here, and they're gathering each king or ruler with his army, and they're all kind of gathering up to Aphek, up at Samaria there, and then they're all going together up to where the green is in the middle. That's where the battle is going to take place. So they're kind of all gathering at this point at Aphek. That's what they're doing. And the Israelites, meanwhile, are camping at the spring at Jezreel, and that's in that green area right in the center there. Verse 2, and the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding on in the rear with Achish. So they're all gathering together. David and his men, they are with Achish. They're either the last to arrive, or they're the last in line, or something of that sort. And verse 3, then the commanders of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? So apparently the five lords, they're kind of gathering and they're surveying their armies. And that's when the other four see David and his men. And they say, what are these Hebrews doing? We're literally going against the Israelites. And here are a bunch of Israelites who are supposed to be with us. That doesn't make any sense. And if you notice, they say the word Hebrews. The Hebrews is typically the term that's used instead of Israelites, because Hebrews is the term that's used by people outside of Israel. So they're Philistines, they're calling them Hebrews. It's more of an ethnic, designating term rather than like calling from one Israelite to another. They would call each other Israelites, but from a foreigner naming them, it would be Hebrew. So that's why they have that distinction of the word term there. And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these days, or rather these years? And I have found no fault in him from the day he deserted to me to this day. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go down to battle with us. Or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sing and dances, and saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? So, interestingly, Achish actually supports David, and he tries to vindicate him. He supports him, and he defends him. Isn't this David? Don't you remember he's been with me and he's served me well? At this point, David and his men have been with Achish for 1 year and 4 months. And they were going on these raids raids on people who were the common enemies of Israel and the Philistines. But he was telling Achish that he was raiding Israel to continue to get more of his confidence in him. So David was deceiving Achish at this point. And I don't know what his plan was all along, but he was trying to keep up that ruse of this image that he is an enemy of Israel. And so Achish is completely convinced, and he goes, don't you see, isn't this David? This David who has been with me, and he has served me well, and I have found no fault in him. But then on the flip side, you have the 4 other lords, and they're like, yeah, isn't this David, the one that's killed like 1 million of our people? Don't you, Achish, what are you doing, man? Don't you realize who this is? And they even bring back the little song that people came up with. Must have been like one-hit wonder of the time or something, because everybody knows it. Even people outside of Israel know this song, that Saul is slain his thousands, but David is 10,000s. They're like, Achish, don't you remember? He's slain our people. And not only that, but he and Saul were allies at one point. That Saul was his king. What better way to get back into favor with the king that you've fallen out of favor with than to infiltrate the Philistines and then go all double agent and, flip on them? They're like, this is a golden opportunity for David. Maybe that's exactly what David was planning. I don't know what he was planning because he never got to that point. But the Philistines, they're thinking, and they're like, no. This can't happen. He and his men, they have to go back. And so Achish, he has to break the news to David in verse 6. Then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me, and the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. Now therefore return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. So really interesting. Did you notice in verse 6 that Achish starts with, as the Lord lives? I don't know if you guys remember this, but as the Lord lives is a very strong Israelite vow. That is something that an Israelite would say, and a very strong oath or promise. It's strong language to show the truth in the words that follow it. But it's something that only an Israelite would say, because it's using their God's name, the Lord, Yahweh. Why would Achish, a Philistine, a pagan, why would he use this terminology? Why would he use this phrase? What are your thoughts on that?
Because he's seen what David can do.
He's seen what David can do, and he's using David's own terms, right, with him. And he goes, David, I know who you are and what you can do, and trust me when I say these words. They are truth out of my mouth. And so in order to really impress the sincerity of what he is saying, he actually uses a phrase that David's familiar with. I'm not sure how else I can kind of compare that to something. I don't know. It would have to be, it's a very personal thing that Achish is doing here, which I think is really, really interesting. And then look at David's response in verse 8. David said to Achish, but what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Have you noticed that David has said that a couple of times now? What have I done? First time he said that was to Eliab, his brother, when he went to the Israelite camp and Goliath is there and he sees Goliath, and David's like, man, somebody's got to take this guy on. And Eliab accuses him. You just want to see a fight, don't you? Yeah, I know what you're doing. I know your heart. And David's like, what have I done? And then the second time with Jonathan, he's pouring out his woes to Jonathan about how Saul is trying to kill him. And he's like, what have I done? What have I done that your dad is trying to kill me? And then the last time is actually to Saul himself. One of the instances where he had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he spared his life. And he talks to Saul afterwards and he goes, what have I done? You have chased me. You have kicked me out of Israel. You've taken my wife and given her to someone else. All of these things, what have I done to deserve all of this? And so David really has this genuine, he's genuinely hurt, and he just wants to be, I guess he wants to be justified. What have I done? Have I actually done something to deserve this? So it's interesting that he's doing this here with Achish, because, yeah, he's deceiving Achish. So I'm not really sure what he was doing. If it was a continuation of the ruse of, his innocence, what have I done, to show, oh man, I don't get to continue on with you? Darn it, Or if he really did want to go into battle. And I highly, highly doubt that he was actually planning on fighting Israelites, truly, because what purpose would he have in that? Everything up to this point, even his entire time as a fugitive, he has done nothing but good for the people of Israel, always. Even when they weren't good to him. He went and saved the town of Keilah, even though Keilah was going to literally betray him like 5 minutes later. All of these things, he's only been for Israel. So I really, really, really strongly doubt that he was actually going to fight against his own fellow kinsmen in this battle. More than likely, he was either trying to continue the ruse of this mercenary for hire that he had been putting forth to Achish, or he was going to use it as an opportunity to maybe, I don't know, either turn on the Philistines, or I don't know if he was going to try and get to Saul. I'm not sure what his plan was in this moment, but he had something in mind. And so verse 9, the other thing about verse 8 that I thought was interesting is where he says, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my Lord the king. Which Lord the king is he talking about? Which enemies is he talking about? He's kind of using ambiguous language here. That's just kind of vague. He's done that before, if you guys remember, with the priest at Nob. Way 10 years ago. Let's see if I can find that. That would have been chapter, 13, 15. Nope, farther. Yeah, here we go. Chapter 21. When David came to Nob, Ahimelech the priest, he came and he's like, why are you alone? And no one's with you. And then David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter in which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. So he uses, again, this vague language of the king has commissioned me. And we kind of talked about that when we went over that chapter. And so he's doing the same thing again here with Achish, where the language is just very, he could mean a couple of things by it. Which enemies, which Lord. And so I think, and he kind of did the same thing with Achish before, when Achish said, hey, you're coming into battle with us. And David said, very well, you'll see what I can do. Whatever that means, right? So I think he's purposefully being careful to paint a certain picture for Achish, while also being very careful about his words. And so we're seeing that here. Verse 9, Achish replied to David, I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said he must not go up with us to the battle. One commentator proposed that possibly David was actually bringing some of the spoils back to Achish, and Achish was kind of benefiting from David's raids. Now that's not given to us in the text, but the text does allow for it. That is a possibility that David was sharing with his spoils with Achish. And Achish was benefiting from David's success. If you remember, everything that David is doing, whatever he does, he is succeeding. He is prospering in everything that he does. God is with him in these things. And Achish ends up kind of benefiting from it. And so Achish is like, I have nothing bad to say about you, but it doesn't come down to just me. He's one of 5 who make these decisions. And so you have to go, David. Verse 10, now then arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who have come with you, and as soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart. So David arose early, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So that is where we leave the Philistines at this point in the story. David and his men, they go back from Aphek, which is like right up here, and they go back down to Ziklag, and the Philistines go on up to the battleground area. So, any thoughts or questions on this chapter here? What can we learn from this chapter about how, what God is doing in David's life?
Well, David wanted to go into battle, and I guess God didn't want him to go into battle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he had his ruse, which, do we assume that God was blessing that?
I don't know about blessing the ruse. I think he was still blessing David and caring for David as his chosen anointed one. God will not, give a green light to deception or anything like that. That was David's choice to deceive and to rely on his deception. However, God is still, I see God caring for David in the sticky situation that David's gotten himself into. Whether that was David's plan or not, he's still in a sticky situation here where things can go wrong very, very quickly. Maybe he would be in a place where he would have to kill a fellow Israelite. Maybe he would be in a place where he would be tempted to go after Saul, even though he has spared Saul's life twice now. Maybe this, maybe that. I don't know. None of us know. But clearly, God is redirecting David away from the scene of the battle. And I think you're right. I think that was God's plan. That was God's design, that David was not meant to be near that battle. Whether it was David's intention to get into that battle or not, I'm not sure.
I bet it was.
Possibly. Either.
He pretty much says that, wait till you see what I can do in battle.
Right. Yeah. I can see it either way. I can see either David saying, we'll see what I can do, and he's thinking in his mind, I'm going to turn on you. Or he doesn't really have the option to say no. He's supposed to be a mercenary for hire. So it would look very, very, very suspicious if he said, sorry, I can't go. I'm going to be sick that day. It would be very strange. So then what does he do? He just says, well, we'll see what I can do. I can see it a couple different ways. But either way, David's in a bad spot here.
Achish clearly believes in David.
Yes.
He's his guy.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
that's why he feels so bad. He wanted David next to him. He must have thought
Oh, yeah.
that would give him some advantage, perhaps.
Well, remember, he made David his bodyguard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
keeper of his head.
Yep, exactly. Yes, keeper of his head. That's right. I forgot your text said that. That was great. I do see, though, that God is providing for David in this moment. And it's really interestingly, we have God providing for David and his men a safe space in Ziklag through a Philistine king. But then we also have David in a tricky situation with the Philistines, and God sparing David from that situation, getting him far away from the battle, also because of Philistine kings. Because of the 4 others, now they're sending David away from the battle. And I think that that was God's providence throughout
They
that.
probably could have just killed him too, but.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
They would have outnumbered him probably.
So, yeah, a lot of providence happening here. What's actually very, very interesting about this chapter is that God would not be mentioned at all if it wasn't for Achish, actually. Achish is the only one that mentions God's name in this chapter. Don't read too much into that, but I just think that that's interesting because we have David in this moment where he's really not, he is not reaching out to God. If you remember in chapter 27, the first verse, typically David is asking God for guidance. God, what do I do? And maybe he had, and he didn't get a clear answer from God for a reason. I don't know what happened, but eventually David got to the point where it says in verse 1, David said to himself, he's like, listen, I've got to come up with a plan here. Okay, self, what are we doing? Okay, David, think. And he comes up with this plan. I've got to get to the Philistine territory because otherwise I'm going to die. And he's forgetting the promises of God. He's forgetting the encouragement that he had received. He's forgetting God's faithfulness to him in the past. And that's kind of the headspace that David is in this moment. And so I think that that's a really good thing to keep in mind as we go into the next chapter, because we're going to see a little bit of a change in David in the next chapter. So
When you say providence, does that mean like the part of God's will that is for sure?
I would say, no, it's more of God's way of providing. That's the providence part. His providing and caring and guiding for his people through other people, through circumstances, through other things. So he provided for David a way out of that tricky situation, away from that battle through the Philistine lords, because they decided David and his men should not be here. So that would be God's providence in that case, yeah. I have a text here, or a quote from one of my commentaries that I really liked. It says, what the text teaches, and that's for this chapter, what the chapter teaches is that even in our folly and our fainting fits, we're still no match for our God, who has thousands of unguessable ways by which he rescues his people, even by the mouths of Philistines. He can make the enemy serve us as a friend. He not only prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemies, but he also has the knack of making the enemies prepare the table. And I thought that was really cool, because we do see David, he's literally living amongst the midst of his enemies. And yet God is providing and caring for him. Even though David did not seek God's instruction in that matter, God is still blessing David. And David is still following God's commands. Not so much the deception part, but he's still serving Israel. He is still, this is still shaping him to become the godly leader for Israel that he will eventually be. So, chapter 30. Let's move into chapter 30. Verse 1. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. And then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. So we have David and his men. Think about the journey they've just been on. They've gone from Gath all the way up here to Aphek, which is kind of near Samaria there. Then they had to go all the way back down, and we saw that that was 3 days later that after they left Aphek. So that's 3 days up at least, 3 days back down, and then they come home almost, a week later to find that their city has been completely burned, and every single person that's part of their group has been taken captive by the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were a very brutal people. Honestly, it's just incredible that nobody was killed and that they were just taken alive. And so this was probably a retaliation on the raids that David had been doing. David had been doing raids, and the Amalekites were part of that. But if you also remember, so Saul had done an attack on the Amalekites back in chapter 15. That's where he was supposed to kill the king, and he didn't. He ended up keeping the king alive, along with some of the animals and stuff like that, like whatever he thought was good to save, even though God's direct command said, don't let anything live. And so perhaps it was retaliation to David, perhaps it was retaliation to Saul. The area that they cover, because we find out later that they kind of attacked an area, the Negev is what it was called, and so it was an area, and Ziklag's part of it. Some of it's Philistine, some of it is Israel, and so they kind of just attack a swath of area. And Ziklag is part of it. But like I said, good news is there's no bodies to be found. People are taken alive as captives. The bad news is now their loved ones are subject to the brutal treatment of these new captors of theirs. And David has absolutely no idea where they are. They don't know. I don't know if they know when that happened, but they're 3 days, they're a full week behind since the last time they've been there. So who knows where they are now? In verse 4, we see David and his people, they're already just drained from the journey, and now this emotional toll just completely saps the strength out of them. They weep until they have no strength in them. And in verse 5 it tells us David's 2 wives had been taken captive. You have Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. And verse 6, moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. For all the people were embittered, each one because of his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So not only are they exhausted from the journey, probably also kind of a mental toll of having to march with Philistines, wondering what they're going to do when they get to that battle. And now God relieved them of that, sent them home, and then they find that when they get home. And now you've got problems from the outside. Now you have problems on the inside. David's own supporters are speaking of stoning him. This is your fault, David. This is all on you. This would have never happened if, X, Y, Z, or whatever. That's what David is dealing with now. Though his own men, who are supposed to be his supporters and the closest people to him, they're now speaking of stoning him. But I did like how it said where, David and the men, they wept, and David wept over not just his own wives, but just the whole city, that everybody was gone. And it reminded me of when Jesus wept over Jerusalem. That sorrow of what's happening. And so it says that David strengthened himself and the Lord is God. What does it look like to strengthen yourself in the Lord? What are your guys' thoughts?
I guess you would have asked him for wisdom of what to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're ready to be stoned and you're outnumbered, and
Yeah. And he does do that in verse 7, where David says, bring me the ephod. He does inquire of God, but before that, he strengthens himself.
Oh,
So what does that look like to kind of strengthen yourself? And he hasn't even talked to God yet.
I don't know, pray? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think it kind of comes down to, I don't know, if you're like me, when I'm going through something difficult, I like to think back on the times where God has provided and been faithful in my life, because that reminds me of who God is, and if he was faithful to me then, he is faithful now. And if he is faithful now, he will continue to be faithful. And it's this, I mean, we've talked about this when we've gone through the Old Testament. God's always saying, remember, remember, remember. He's always telling them to remember all the times where he's been good to them and he's provided for them. Remember how I brought you through the Red Sea. Remember how I brought you out of Egypt. Remember how this, remember that. Teach that to your children. Write it on things and tie it to yourself. I mean, literally, whatever it takes to remember who God is and what he has done for you, because we are very forgetful creatures. And then we freak out. So remembering is a big part of strengthening. We remember God's past providence, his faithfulness, and then it brings us to the present. We can talk with him and communicate with him. God, you were so good to me at that time. And you took care of me even when I wasn't sure what was going to happen or how I was going to come through that. Thank you for that. And I know that you are still good. I know that you are still powerful, God. I know all these things, and I'm remembering all these things. And so then we have this hope. We can look to the future. We're remembering the promises that are yet to come. We know that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And so we're moving forward with that now. And I think that that's the encouragement that strengthened David. And we see that in the Psalms. When you're reading the Psalms, David did that all the time. He would remember, how wonderful God is. He would remind himself of that. He would declare it. He would remember the wonderful things that God did in his life and in Israel's history, those kinds of things. And so I think, and then a lot of times it would be, a psalm where he's like, would you break the teeth of my enemies, and whatever. He's wanting God to come and deliver of something, but then at the end it was always, but I know that my God is good, or I know that my God will deliver me, or I know this. And he just had this assurance by the end of the psalm that God is still a good God. And so he strengthens himself in the Lord. Verse 7, we see, then he inquires of God. So David asks Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. Remember, the ephod is part of the high priest's garments that it was like a pocket that held the Urim and the Thummim, and those were the tools that were used to help decide God's will. You could ask of God a question, and somehow, we don't really know how, but somehow these tools would give an answer. A lot of people think it was two stones, and one was negative, one was positive, or whatever. I don't really know. It doesn't matter. What we know is that God used those in order to help make clear what his will is for his people in certain moments. And this was one of those moments. So David, verse 8, David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. And verse 9, so David went, he and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those left behind remained. But David pursued, he and 400 men, for 200 who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor remained behind. So we've got this group of 600, and they kind of end up being divided. You have 200 who's just too exhausted to go forward. They cannot even cross this river that they come to. And so they stay behind with the baggage and other supplies, and David and 400 men move forward. If you remember, he did the same thing back in chapter 25, I think it was, with Nabal and Abigail, and that chapter, he decides, I'm taking men to go up against Nabal, and he leaves 200 behind with the rest of the families and with their things, their belongings, and he takes 400 to go up against Nabal. So this is very similar here. And so we've got David at 400, verse 11. Now they found an Egyptian in the field, and they brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. They gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate. Then his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. I think this is so interesting, because if you think about it, put yourselves in the minds of these men. They have been marching with Philistines. They have journeyed for almost a week. They come home to find their city burned, their wives and their children taken off as captives to a brutal people. They are not in a good mind space right now. They are probably looking for blood, is what they are doing. Clearly they were about to stone David. So they are very, very angry right now. They're probably in the mindset of shoot first, ask questions later, kind of a mindset. But what do? They come across this Egyptian, and he's in the field, and it turns out that he's in bad shape, because he's been there for 3 days and 3 nights without any provisions whatsoever. And we later find out that he was sick. And what do? They provide for him. They bring him back to David. They feed him. They give him water. They care for him. Then they not only are giving him food and drink, they're giving him from their own rations. So they are truly showing grace and generosity here, which is something only that comes from a godly leader like David. And so I think that that's really incredible. It's this generosity that comes from a leader like David. He cares about people. And compare that now to Saul. You guys remember Saul had that very prideful and foolish command on his own people to not eat anything until they had conquered their enemy. They had chased him all the way down. And it was just such a foolish thing for him to do, and very prideful. And so compare that with David and how he is acting here. And so they could interrogate the man. They could torture him to get questions out of him, but instead they feed him and they provide for him and they are generous with him. And then they just ask him. David says in verse 13, "To whom do you belong and where are you from?" And he said, "I'm a young man of Egypt, a servant of an Amalekite, and my master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. We made a raid on the Negev of the Cherethites and on that which belongs to Judah and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." So he was actually part of the raid that happened against David and his men and their families. And so they could have been like, well, that's her head, sorry, They could have done that, but they didn't. So then, verse 15, then David said to him, "Will you bring me down to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band." So, no love lost here. He's like, listen, my master literally left me to die when I was sick. I don't really want to go back to him. Just promise that you're going to spare my life and spare me from my master, and I will take you wherever you want to go. I'll give you whatever you want in this moment. And so, verse 16, when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And so they come across the Philistines, and they are just they are just living it up with all the spoils. They're celebrating their great success, and that is where David and his men find them. And it must have been evening, because then they wait until the next morning. Verse 17, David slaughtered them from the twilight until the evening of the next day. So they wait until the Amalekites are probably like hungover and just like drowsy and not prepared at all for anything to come their way. And David and his men have had a moment to rest. And then they fight them all day long. And I love this. This next part of verse 17 really puts into perspective just how outnumbered David and his men were. Because it says, not a man of them escaped except for 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So if 400 was a small number that escaped from the Amalekites, how many men did David have? 400. Yeah, that's what puts it into perspective. Just how outnumbered David was, and just how much God was involved in granting a victory to David and his men in this. It would have been impossible, really. The odds were completely against them, but God gave them this victory. And so, verse 18, so David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives, but nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. He redeems everything that the enemy had taken. David brings it all back and more, because it wasn't just the spoils of Ziklag, it was the spoils from all the area that they had raided. And so they have this abundance now. And so verse 20, so David had captured all the sheep and the cattle, which the people drove ahead of the other livestock, and they said, this is David's spoil. I love that small parallel of David to Jesus. Jesus redeems everything that the enemy has taken and more. There's an abundance now. He says, I want you to have life and life abundant. And that's exactly what Jesus brings to us. And David is just a small part in showing that here. And so verse 21, we see David's generosity once again. When David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David, who had also been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him, then David approached the men and greeted them. So this was a happy reunion of all the people. But then you have in verse 22, then all the wicked and worthless men among those who went with David said, because they do not go with us, and we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except to every man his wife and his children, that they may lead them away and depart. Probably the same people who wanted to stone David, honestly, because what nasty, nasty guys these are. You've got these just, I don't know, they're greedy men. They're worthless and wicked is what it calls them. And they don't want to share their spoils with the 200 who stayed behind. They want to say, you know what, just take your families and get out of here. You're not even allowed to be part of our group because you didn't risk your lives. And David rebukes that. And he says in verse 23, then David said, you must not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. The Lord has given us. Not with you had got you yourself, but what the Lord has given us. Who has kept us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us. And who will listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down to the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And so it has been from that day forward that he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. And now when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah, to his friends, saying, behold, a gift for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. And then it goes on to say all the different cities. I'm not going to go ahead and pronounce all of those because I'll do a terrible job. Mm-hmm. But there's a bunch of different cities that he sends spoils to. And at the very end, verse 31, it says, and to those who were in Hebron, and to all the places where David himself and his men were accustomed to going. So clearly David and his men had supporters kind of scattered through the area. We've seen plenty of instances where there was people who were more than happy to betray him, but he clearly also had people who were with him. And so he's saying, you know, listen, you've blessed us in our times of need, and now I want to bless you. And he's sharing the spoil with them as a grateful gesture for what they have done. And David's leading his men in the same truth that Jesus taught his disciples, where it doesn't matter whether you risked your life in battle or whether you stayed behind with the baggage. Everyone gets their share, their fair share. Everyone gets to enjoy the blessings of this victory. And Jesus had the same teaching. Matthew 20 tells us of a parable that Jesus taught about the workers in the vineyard. You've got the landowner who goes out early in the morning and he hires people, come work in my vineyard and you'll get a day's wage, a denarius. And then he goes out mid-morning and he hires more people with the same promise. And at noon and at mid-afternoon and then even at evening, at the end of the day, he hires people and says, come work for me and you will get a day's wage. And at the end of it all, what does he do? He pays everyone exactly what he has promised to them. And the people who were there first thing in the morning are absolutely ticked that the people who got there and only worked for a couple of hours are getting the same pay. And what's his answer to them? Do I not get to be generous with whom I want to be generous? Do I not get to do what I want to do with what's mine? And why are you jealous of my generosity? And that's exactly the same thing that David is doing here. He's showing the same truths of God 1,000 years before Jesus would even tell that parable. That's the beauty of it. Because it all comes from God and is God's. And he can choose to be generous in the ways that he wants to be generous. And David really understands this generous heart of God. And it's part of what makes him a man after God's own heart. And we're seeing that time and time again. We're also seeing that he is still fully human and a sinful being. And that's what reminds us that he's not the Messiah. He's not the promised one. But he points us toward the promised one. And he also shows us little pieces of what God's heart is like for his people and leading his people. And so we have this incredible opportunity to see the life of David here. We're going to end here at chapter 30 because I don't have time to go into 31. But what we'll do is we'll do 31 and we're just going to go straight into 2 Samuel because why stop the story here, you know? And we'll get into 2 Samuel. So just go ahead and do chapter 31 and then chapter 1 of 2 Samuel for next week. Any thoughts or questions on chapter 30 there?
I was thinking that was also wise of him to do that because it instills loyalty.
Yeah.
As his kingdom grows,
Yeah.
then the people would realize he didn't keep it all for himself.
Yeah.
That he shared with his subjects.
Yeah.
And that's a very smart thing to do because that's what a king needs. They need that
Yeah.
loyalty
Right.
from everybody.
Yeah. He's faithful to them, and they in turn are faithful to him. Yeah. What makes him makes you want to follow him, right? Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? No? Okay. Marilee, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Sure.
Thank you.
Father, thank you again for a beautiful day and for the opportunity we have to share in your word. Thank you for the wonderful turnout tonight and what each lady here brings to this group. Help us to realize that in every story there's truth and wisdom for us to glean. Help us to be able to keep it in our heart and apply it to our life. Be with us now as we go home. Keep everyone safe. And we thank you for all your blessings on our lives. In Christ's name, amen.
Thanks, Marilee.